everybody. This is the Foreign Press Association in New York, and I'm the president, Ian Williams, and it gives, pleasure's the wrong word for these things. We keep having to use these formula, but you can hardly take pleasure in discussing a genocide and murderously tyrannical regimes, which is what we're about to do with Michela Wrong, a veteran Africa correspondent and author, who her book, let me wave it about. Do Not Disturb, the story of a political murder and an African regime gone bad. And I understand that Michela actually took John le Carre around the region to show him how things were done. And he recognized it, of course, it's very similar. And Michela's book is distinctive because it isn't just a boring history of movements. It centers around somebody who obviously was an engaging, charismatic individual. Patrick, her friend, who was the, unfortunately, straight out of John le Carre, he was up to his elbows in blood as well, it seems, because he was part of this apparatus to begin with Paul Kagame. And it's one of the great no-nos to try and suggest that Paul Kagame has done any wrong, or that the Rwandan Patriotic Front might have mud on its boots, was for years taken as almost complicity in genocide. And people have suggested it. Unfortunately, a lot of the people who suggested it were basically genuine apologists for genocide, often from the French government, who patronized the previous regime. So it's really refreshing to get Michela's book showing just how this happened, not just in Rwanda, but how the rest of the world took it, just how people's perceptions and how journalists like ourselves were hoodwinked. I mean, a year or two ago, I would have thought, no, you can't say this about Kagame and the RPF. You're obviously in support of genocide. But the evidence is laid out, and by her and other people, showing just how sinister the Rwandan regime is and has been and continues to be. So, Michela, was it the murder which crystallized this for you, or had you, what was your road to Kigali when you discovered that your previous sort of assumptions might have been wrong?
I think it was a slow process because I was a journalist for a long time working for the Financial Times based in Nairobi, and Rwanda was just one of the countries that I covered. And obviously it got a lot of my attention because this was in the mid-90s. It had been through this extraordinary, horrific trauma. And then you saw all the impact that was having on the region when the rebel movement that the Rwandan army supported swept into what was then Zaire and got rid of Mobutu. So that was an ongoing story. And I suppose that those were the years where I sort of saw the RPF when it was a very united band of sort of an elite brotherhood of warriors. And then I left Africa. I did other things. I had another job at my newspaper. I ended up leaving the newspaper, started writing books, wrote a book about Mobutu, wrote a book about Eritrea, wrote a book about corruption in Kenya, and only vaguely followed Rwanda during all that time, and vaguely heard news. And what I heard was that people that I had known, who I hadn't known particularly well, and Patrick Karegeya, the former head of intelligence, was one of them, that, this was no longer such a united movement as it had been, that people were falling out of power, that I was hearing stories about, assassinations of political leaders. Sendashonga, the Hutu interior minister, was assassinated in exile. You heard stories about increasing repression. You heard stories about people defecting, fleeing the country. And then hearing that Patrick was one of them, which was a surprise. And then meeting Patrick once when he came through London, once then in South Africa. And then the news breaking that he'd been killed, strangled in a hotel room in South Africa, the Michelangelo, where he had been lured by a friend, a businessman friend, a Rwandan called Apollo. And that was like, goodness, that was a real shock. And it just made me think, my God, firstly, I thought that man has gone with so many secrets and so much inner knowledge of the Rwandan Patriotic Front, that former rebel movement running the country. He died with so much knowledge and so many secrets with him. But also you wondered, well, this man had been the closest possible aide to Paul Kagame, the president. They'd actually been to school together. They'd been in the bush together in Uganda when they were young revolutionaries for Yoweri Museveni. You sort of thought, well, how did we get here? And so I just thought it would be interesting, to try and tell the story of what had happened to the Rwandan Patriotic Front through the story of what had happened to him. And I wasn't sure it was going to be possible, so I reached out to his family, because I thought this is only going to work if the family are going to be honest and open with me. I reached out to his widow, who I'd never met before, and she was very open. I reached out to his nephew, David Batenga. He was also very open, told me everything he knew. And I began to think, okay, there's a story here that needs to be teased out, because a movement that ends up with a president ordering the assassination of his former most trusted aide and one of his closest friends has gone off the rails. And it would be very interesting to explain how. The thing is that what I realized is that Patrick's death was just one of many. And that the victims of these assassinations were no longer the Hutu extremists who sort of had been, pushed out of the country by the RPF, the people who committed the genocide, who remained sort of the long-term enemies of Paul Kagame. These were insiders, and Patrick Karegeya was just one of them, and they were being systematically targeted, hunted down, tracked, threatened, harassed, and in some cases killed. So that became something much more obvious to me the more research I did. So that was how the book started.
Now, one of the things you bring out is that the real hero for the exiles, for the RPF, was not Kagame, who was a sort of fairly dull apparatchik. You're going to have to forgive me about the pronunciation. Rwigema, is it?
Rwigema, Fred Rwigema. Yeah.
Fred Rwigema, thank you.
Yeah.
I've only seen it in print. I've never heard it pronounced before. So, I mean, he was the sort of real icon. He was the national liberation leader, the Yasser Arafat, the Kwame Nkrumah, or whatever. And he came to an untimely demise right at the beginning in dubious circumstances. And a hint, you don't say explicitly that you think he was, that this was yet another political assassination.
Yes, I mean, Fred was someone I vaguely knew about. He was this iconic figure. He still is an iconic figure in the history of the RPF. I had decided to go back and find out, how the RPF was born. It was a movement that came out of Uganda. It was a movement many of whose members were Rwandan Tutsis who had been expelled from Rwanda during the pogroms. Of an earlier era. They had grown up, they spent 30 years growing up in Uganda, feeling like outsiders, feeling like aliens. And when Yoweri Museveni came along and set up his own guerrilla movement to challenge Milton Obote, they joined because they felt that they needed to learn how to fight. They needed a cause, and they were going to learn how to fight and how to handle weapons, and then they were going to reclaim their homeland by using that experience. And Fred became the sort of center point, the rallying champion of that movement. And he was young, he was charismatic, he was adored by his men. He was somebody that everyone took to their hearts and felt an immediate loyalty to. He was the kind of military leader that people are ready to die for. And he was also extremely close to Yoweri Museveni. So when Yoweri Museveni wins power in 1986, Fred is at his right-hand side and becomes a very important person in the army, the Ugandan army as well. And then his focus turns to, we're going to go back to Rwanda. We're going to use this fighting skills that we've acquired and also some equipment that we will steal from the Ugandan army, and we're going to take back our homeland.
Was that steal in quotes or actual steal?
Well, no, I mean, they disappeared with a huge amount of kit, and it was all very well prepared. They pre-positioned supplies. They took,
but what was this Ugandan tacit complicity?
Well, that's one of the big questions, because Museveni was very much embarrassed when that invasion took place in 1990 in the eyes of the world. And he needed to have deniability, and he did deny that he'd played any role in that. But they basically helped themselves to some of the best equipment that the Ugandan army had at its disposal. And then when they got into trouble, they went back into Uganda, and their men got treated in Ugandan hospitals and found succor on Ugandan territory. So the Ugandan role in that is very obvious. But as you mentioned, Fred died on the second day of the invasion. And there are two conflicting stories about how he died. One is that he was killed by a stray bullet, possibly fired by French special forces that were supporting Juvenal Habyarimana's army. But the other version is that he was actually killed by his closest lieutenants, who were jealous of him, didn't want him to be leading this elite force as it
he was Moses. He led them across Sinai. Now it's ours.
And they didn't want him to end up being the next president of Rwanda, and they shot him, and then they were shot in their turn. I've never known what the answer to that question is, and I think that's one of the great mysteries that hangs over Rwandan history. Fred has become a kind of martyr-like figure. He's a sort of saint-like figure. You see his picture often on the Twitter accounts of young Rwandans who feel a bit disillusioned with what's going on in Rwanda now, and they need someone to look up to. And he sort of represents the ideals that the RPF had when it first went into Rwanda, which was to be a sort of democratic, ethnic reconciling movement. It wanted to be to sort of win power, oust Habyarimana, who had become associated with horrific repression of Tutsis, and also with single party rule and a really corrupt system. So they were sort of saying, no, we can be a force for unity. We're going to be a multi-party movement. And I think, we've seen a sort of slippage on many of those ideals. And so Fred represents the RPF at its best in the eyes of many young Rwandans.
But I gather that sort of over-Slavic support of him in Rwanda is quite dangerous. He's an icon, but he's an icon that Kagame, over devotion to him implies disrespect for the president.
There's a sensitivity on the subject of Fred, because Kagame was one of his closest friends, and Fred was a kind of elder brother figure to him at the front, during the Bush years. And I think, Kagame has always been aware that he doesn't have the charisma or the popularity or the immediate unquestioning loyalty of his men. And Fred had all those things. And so the comparison sort of is one that riles him. So it's a touchy subject. And occasionally when you see there have been incidents of Kagame flying off the handle, it's sometimes a reference to Fred that will trigger those outbursts.
A trigger moment. We have a question from Alice Cusa. The book seems to be a one-sided story. Why didn't you make more of an effort to hear President Kagame's side of the story? I suspect the book explains this, but you can do it now.
Yeah, it was part of the one-sidedness is that the process of researching it. I was dealing, my key interviews I knew were going to be with Tutsi former insiders who had been very high up in the regime, very close to Kagame, and who had left in fear for their lives. One of them was General Kayumba Nyamwasa, the former head of the armed forces, who had had 4 separate attempts on his life, and he's still got a bullet in his back where he survived 1 assassination attempt. And many of the other people I was, and I managed to end up talking to, have scattered around the world in North America, Europe, Africa, and they were people who knew that they were in danger, constant danger. They'd been told by their local police forces in Belgium, France, in the States, and South Africa that here in the UK, that their lives were at risk, that they were in danger, that there was information available to those local police forces that the Rwandan government wanted them dead. So it was quite hard to set up those meetings. It was hard to win their trust. And if I had been going in and out of Kigali at the same time as trying to get interviews with those people, I simply wouldn't have been able to get interviews, because they would have regarded me as a potential spy, someone who's reporting back, somebody who was possibly passing key details pertaining to their security back to Kigali and the intelligence services that were trying to kill them. So during all the time that I was doing the research, I was focusing on them. When I had done most of those interviews, I could have gone to Kigali and tried to interview Kagame and people like intelligence chiefs, Jack Nziza, Dan Manyuza, former military head James Kabarebe. But the problem by then was that I was now worried about my own security, in that I was damn sure that my presence and all the interviews I'd done with these exiles were very well known to Kigali, because they keep very close tabs and they're very good at intercepting people's phone calls and tracking emails. They're really experts when it comes to cyber espionage. And so I didn't actually feel safe about going back to Kigali myself to do those interviews. And then the other question I asked myself was, how interesting are those interviews going to be? If I had gone to Kagame and I'd sort of asked him a few patsy questions and then at the end said, well, actually what I really want to talk to you is, why did you order the killing of your best friend? I don't think that that interview
Comrade Stalin, explain why Trotsky was a threat.
I don't think that would have produced an interesting result, nor would I have been in the office for very much longer. And from that moment, I would have probably been escorted to the airport. So I sort of thought, well, what am I going to get out of going out on that token trip? Apart from putting my own safety in peril, and then getting a completely useless and uninformative interview. I mean, what I was essentially be asking them about are crimes that would carry, in any normal legal system, would carry heavy sort of prison sentences. So you do tend to find that people throw you out of their offices at the stage where you ask those questions.
Well, we're moving into an area that I think is important that you cover in the book, tangentially but informatively, the question of impunity. The fact that it's almost up on a par with Mossad and Shin Bet. They can do no wrong, according to some people. And so Kagame, the RPF and Kagame have had assassination squads around the world. Western rulers know this. The police forces go and warn the potential victims. They pick people up with guns in their hands on the way to assassinate. Obviously connected to the state. Rwandan embassies and high commissions across the world have functioned very directly as nodes in this, and yet everyone treats them with kid gloves. It isn't brought up. And the aid keeps going in. Diplomatic and financial support keeps going to Kigali, because somehow Kagame, well, yes, he's a murderer, but he's our murderer. He pushes our view of how Africa should be, even though you will point out as well that the statistics might well be spurious.
Yeah, I think that's what really shocked me. That's the thing that sort of took me most aback, is I hadn't realized when I started researching the book how much evidence there was of this extraterritorial, intimidation and assassination program being waged, as you say, using the embassies, the Rwandan embassies in the various countries as the sort of nodal points. And it was quite clear that the police forces and intelligence services in the countries where these exiles were being targeted knew everything about them. And you thought, there would be a light scolding seemed to be occasionally administered to Kagame or one of his ministers, or
get caught.
Yes,
Don't embarrass us.
You're overdoing it here. You've got to stop doing that. And you kind of think, well, we've had Saudi Arabia doing this, we've had Russia doing this, and when it happens with Saudi Arabia or Russia, Khashoggi or Skripal, we make a big fuss, our Western governments make a big fuss, and there are enormous diplomatic consequences. And with Kagame, he gets a little light scolding. When in the case of South Africa, for example, when there was the inquest into Patrick Karegeya's murder, it was delayed for 5 years, and it became blatantly obvious, and I recount this in the book, that 5-year delay was simply because the South Africans found this a very embarrassing issue and they really didn't want to explore it. And since these 2 arrest warrants have been issued, it's not like anyone's been desperately pushing the Rwandans to extradite these 2 suspects. And it's a very, very soft ride. And I think the trouble is, as with all these things, if you don't administer a sharp response, then the person concerned knows he can keep doing it. And I think that's why we can expect that this will continue and it'll get worse, because Kagame has never paid a particularly high price for it, or any price at all, really. So why shouldn't he just continue? And I think the rendition of Paul Rusesabagina, the hotel Rwanda manager, falls into that scheme where you have a president who feels like, well, this guy, he's a thorn in our side. He's a very vocal critic. He's got far too much attention and admiration and supporters in America and elsewhere. We're going to call him to heel. We're going to show him who's boss, and we can get him. He's in Texas. We'll get him. We'll trick him onto a plane, and we'll get him. We're going to get him in a court, dressed in a pink uniform, and we'll show him that we can get you wherever you are. I think that was part of that. And it was extraordinarily daring, but also, as far as I can see, a completely illegal operation. I mean, why didn't Paul Kagame just ask for his extradition? Why wasn't an arrest warrant drawn up for Paul Rusesabagina if the evidence of his terroristic activities is so clear? Why didn't they just ask the Americans to extradite him? There've been other extraditions. Why not that one? But it's kind of like, well, we don't need to bother about that because we do things our way,
Shades of Mordecai Vanunu and Israel. Similar way how to spray somebody out.
There are a lot of parallels, I think, between the way Mossad has operated and the way the Rwandans do. And I think that one of the characteristics of intelligence services is that they mimic one another. They learn lessons from one another.
But you imply that the connection was sort of a little more organizational than that at some point.
Yes, I mean, there's definitely been exchange of intelligence know-how between the Israelis and the Rwandans. I mean, the Rwandans really are, in Africa, they're probably one of the best equipped African countries in terms of listening in on your WhatsApp messages, reading your emails. They know how to do that. And what we've understood, thanks to the Financial Times doing some really good reportage on this, is that it's Israeli-made spyware that was originally came from the military sector and has become a commercial product that African countries like Rwanda can acquire.
How deeply can the regime tap the Russian biochemical expertise?
I don't know. I didn't go there.
Okay, maybe that's just as well. What's your cup of tea? I've looked dubiously at cups of tea ever since. I make it myself. One of the points was the economic. Rwanda is held up continually as a wonderful example of the Washington consensus at work, and you put some doubts on that. And Ralph Sina from German Public Radio makes the point: Volkswagen built a factory not in Nairobi or Addis, Addis Ababa, but in Kigali. Why?
Rwanda's has this image of being a fabulous, the Rwanda under Paul Kagame, of being a fabulous place to open a business, and of being corruption-free, and a place where things work and things get done. And there's a very impressive bunch of articulate technocrats that you have dealings with. I don't know if you're familiar, but there's something called the Doing Ease of Business index that is issued by the World Bank, and Rwanda scores really puzzlingly high on that, I have to say. I mean, it's obviously, I would totally agree that Rwanda is an easier place to open a business than in neighboring DRC, for example. But
well,
I find,
yes.
I find it puzzling. If you look at that index, you would think that it's an easier place to do business than Czechoslovakia, the Czech Republic, or Poland, or, you know, and I would really query that. So I think that's that index has been challenged, and you know, there are a lot of people who feel that the index needs a good tough look, not for Rwanda, for the reasons of Rwanda's positioning on it, but because of there's a feeling that it's been tweaked and manipulated by various countries. So, and I think there is this perception. I used to go to a lot of conferences in London, business conferences, where you know, Rwanda would always be unveiled at the end of the conference as the most exciting, most promising investment destination. Personally, I think it's that's a slightly misleading scenario, because if you look at the Rwandan economy, it's really dominated by Crystal Ventures, which is the RPF's sort of conglomerate, which has really already soaked up all the most exciting possibilities, you know, and you know, what it enjoys is Crystal Ventures companies have access to the presidential family. They enjoy benign tax relationships, and they get all the juicy plums. And if you're in a foreign company going into Rwanda, you will find that it's not exactly a level playing field. And I think if you actually look at the figures, and I have, investment in Rwanda's economy is quite disappointing, given its glossy image. Nothing like as impressive as it should be, given, you know, given all the
well, that's Churchill said, there are lies, there are damned lies, and then there are statistics. Is the ultimate in untruths and terminological inexactitudes. So we have Ben Honans as a foreign correspondent covering Africa. Isn't it your responsibility to not stereotype Africans, given how much Western knowledge of Africa is affected by these stereotypes? Do you regret your decision to open your book by implying that Rwanda is a nation of liars?
Yeah, that certainly has annoyed some people. The funny thing about the way I start my book is that it hasn't annoyed the Rwandans that I've interviewed, and that really were the people who sort of were my way into the story, the whistleblowers. They weren't at all irritated or shocked by that. They were fine by the start of the story. The point of that discussion in my introduction is I wanted the reader to be very aware that what we're dealing with is a series of conflicting narratives, and a narrative that was presented to the world in one way and defended to the hilt very, very ferociously by certain men in positions of power and privilege, and that the people I'm interviewing in the book later went on to say that narrative happens to be a lie, and it's not the truth, and we lied to you and we took you for a ride, but now we want you to know the truth. And that presents any journalist, any writer with a real challenge, because you're thinking, well, which version am I supposed to believe? And so I wanted to put that on the table and say, this is the challenge. And especially it's a challenge because I was dealing with a lot of people who worked in intelligence, and intelligence is all about fabricating narratives and, you know, covering up what's really happened and presenting a cosmetic exterior to the world. So these were all intelligence. Many of my interviewees were people who'd worked in intelligence, and you know, they were now saying, we're whistleblowers, believe us. So it was a question of sort of saying, let's be honest, that this is a book in which a lot of the key protagonists, you know, there are question marks over the reliability of witnesses. So I was actually saying, this is the challenge for anyone writing about this region. And this is a challenge in particular because you're dealing with a culture that talks about itself in this way. And Congolese people, you know, when you interview a Congolese, which I did for my first book about Mobutu, they'll present themselves in a certain way. Kenyans also have their own stereotypes that they like to explore and present you with. And Rwandans and Ugandans also do, and they're very different from one another. So that's what I
So it's not an African stereotype, it's a Rwandan stereotype.
Exactly, it's not an African stereotype, it's a Rwandan stereotype. It's something Rwandans say of themselves.
Well, I got shades of it from my times in Rwanda and the Congo. And but what I found it very useful for your book, because basically you're signaling that the whole book is a sort of quantum work. Everything is true and not true at the same time.
Yeah, and it's very hard to pick apart the reality. And one of the things I wanted to lay out is you know, which version do you believe? Which one is more likely to be true? Is, you know, if you have a series of people who are saying, this is now the narrative I want you to embrace, but they told you a different narrative, you know, do you believe them when they were at the height of their powers and firing on all, and, you know, and sort of they had minions running around for them, and they had, you know, they were running a state? Or do you believe them now when they're out on their ear, they've lost their jobs, their lives are in danger, and they're on the run? And my feeling was, I believe them, I'm more likely to believe them now because they've lost everything. They don't have jobs at stake. They don't have, you know, assets they're likely to lose, houses that are going to be seized, businesses that are going to be appropriated. They've lost everything. So they're more likely to be honest now.
Well, it brings so many of us in the West took these on face value. And I mean, we fall into this automatic binary position. I think, as we were discussing earlier, that obviously there was a genocide of Tutsis. A horrific wrong was collectively on them and the Hutus, although I understand the Hutu victims are now being written out of the official Rwandan histories from what you say. So we instinctively think they must be right. But this, you know, this is the same as saying that Benjamin Netanyahu must always be right because of what happened to his people, to Jews during World War II. It does not equate. Milosevic, because the Serbs were on the side of the Allies during World War II, he never committed any crimes afterwards because he couldn't have done. It's this sort of binary thinking which trapped the West. And one of the questions that's come up from David Smith in The Guardian, the Biden administration is suddenly sort of, I must confess, I had very low expectations of them. So it's taking quite principled stands on, for example, on the Saudis, you know, disapproving of them putting journalists into meat grinders, which I don't approve of that. I approve of him taking a strong stand on it. So is the Biden administration likely to take any type of tougher line on Kagame? Or have we collectively bought into the RPF myth, and that will make it impossible?
I think that's a really big question, I'm going to be really interested to see the answer to that. We had a few indications during the human rights peer review process that took place at the United Nations recently, where both the US delegates and the UK delegates were raising in a very pointed fashion Rwanda's human rights record as a concern. I think in more forthright language than most people were used to hearing, and that it caused a big stir, you know, in Kigali, and there was a sort of bit of a shocked reaction. And that may well be signaling that a tougher line is going to be taken in future. I think it's one of the interesting issues is that Samantha Power is now heading USAID. And of course, Rwanda is a massive recipient of foreign aid, which in the past was, you know, coming, a lot of it was coming, the key donors were, you know, the UK via DFID, and the US was giving it via USAID. Samantha Power has a long history of writing about genocide and Rwanda. She spent a lot of time in Kigali when she was researching her book. And she knew Patrick Karegeya, the assassinated head of intelligence, very well. So conception of what is going on in Rwanda and how that regime has or hasn't changed mirrors the trajectory that I've been on, and that many of the journalists and diplomats and aid workers that I speak to have been on, because, you know, our views have not remained constant. There's no reason why Samantha Power's should remain constant either. So that will be very interesting. Here in the UK, we've already got major aid cuts coming because we've been hard hit by COVID, and it's already been announced that their aid is going to be massively cut. So Rwanda will be automatically seeing its aid budget from the UK cut. So, you know, the leverage that aid supplies means that, you know, I think Kigali should be watching and very alert to whether or not the relationship is changing a bit. The Commonwealth Head of Governments meeting is going to be in Kigali this year, which is a controversial choice of venue. It should have happened last year because of COVID, it didn't. Again, I'll be interested to see whether during the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, which are usually extremely, you know, ceremonial and a lot of flowery phrases are voiced, and it can seem to lack a certain grittiness, whether some more muscular interventions will be raised by the countries attending that meeting, who will be saying, you know, we're concerned about what's happening on the human rights front. We hear about your elections, which are being systematically rigged. We know that the opposition parties are not really worth the title in Rwanda. We see that your press is basically his master's voice. There's no independent press of any real validity. And whether they'll raise those issues with Kagame, I hope they will.
The other issue that you bring out in your book is the intimate involvement of Rwanda in the war in the Congo. And we speak about Rwanda as it's a faraway country of which people know little. But you know, the Congo is possibly the longest lasting, most disastrous war in the last century. And it's been going on almost undercover as far as the West is concerned. And the Rwandan state has been making out like bandits from it. As far as I can tell, the extraction of wealth from cell phone equipment, cell phone raw materials to diamonds has been huge. It's been looted by the Rwandan army, and
that is still going on.
War.
Yeah, that is still happening and is very underreported on. I think the war, I mean, war is a difficult word to apply to Eastern Congo, you know, because what you've got is a sort of series of small militia groups, over 100, whose areas and turfs, areas of control are constantly changing. And how much active fighting there is going on. I mean, I wouldn't be able to tell you, I'm not an expert on Eastern Congo, but and the real death toll, the death toll from the years, decades of instability and turmoil in that area is stunningly high. But if you look at all the reports, it's a death toll that is the result of malnutrition, you know, things like malaria that never gets treated, kids dying of dehydration and diarrhea, people never having quite enough to eat because they can't cultivate their crops. So I sometimes think the word war is kind of misleading, but it's certainly an area that has been, you know, gone through some really turbulent times, still is in a state of turbulence.
It's like the European 30 Years' War.
Yeah,
I mean, it devastated a whole continent for a long time.
And I think that, you know, certainly the Rwandan government has not played any helpful role in stabilizing it. It's done quite the opposite. It's, you know, time and time again, what you see is the Rwandans going in and supporting some, you know, Congolese rebel movement, which is busy sort of creating its zone of influence. And the villagers are paying the price. And the mineral looting is definitely going on and is very underreported. And the just sort of the minerals that are being sucked out of the earth and then taken across the border and sold as
so this is conflict diamonds and conflict coltan being traded flagrantly in defiance of UN resolutions.
All of these things were supposed to be policed, and you know, bagging systems have been, labeling and tagging and labeling systems have been introduced. And from what I hear from my sources in the mineral industry, it carries on notwithstanding, regardless.
Simon Locke is talking about the shadow of past colonialism, why the West is not as willing to call out African leaders, in particular Kagame. Well, I mean, the West can hardly call him out if they helped install him in a way, but it's, you know, it is an accusation that the Rwandans will immediately produce of racism when anyone tries to interfere, isn't it?
Well, the accusation that the Rwandans use, and it works very well because it has a certain validity, is how dare, Kagame will say to people, including journalists, how dare you upbraid us? How dare you throw our human rights records in our face? Where were you when the '94 genocide happened? You pulled your UN troops out of Kigali. You left us to die. What did you care? You know, do not give us any moral lessons. So he will say that, and that often works, and people feel, you know, humbled and ashamed. But of course, you know, the fact that the West behaved sort of shabbily and disreputably in 1994 doesn't then excuse the way a modern Rwandan government today is behaving, you know, towards anyone who stands up to it, challenges it, or wants to just enjoy what we would regard as ordinary freedom of speech. I think, but there is something else at play, which is the Rwanda has become the symbol of developmental success, and you know, it scores so well on these sustainable development goals, and it ticks every box. It looks great. People from the IMF and World Bank, and you know, all these NGOs that go and work there, they're just sort of enamored of the relationship they enjoy with the technocrats they meet, who are sort of dynamic and get things done. And that has sort of, I think the West has become very hungry for success stories in Africa. You know, there used to be a time where we talk about the donor darlings in Africa being Uganda, Ethiopia, and Rwanda. And now Ethiopia is in the grips of a horrific civil war in Tigray. Uganda, it just saw incredibly violent, rigged elections, and everyone feels that Museveni is a despot who is sort of turning into the cliche of the despot. And so people are clinging like sort of crazy to Rwanda as the sort of the model, the donor darling, and they don't want to let it go. And I think what you see in Rwanda is a sort of a developmental, you know, a whole philosophy of how you engage with poor African countries that is sort of being put to the test, and the people involved in that industry simply don't want to let it go.
Frank Gomez is asking what Rwanda will be like in 2 years or 5 years. What hope is there for real change? More of the same, or, you know, a helicopter accident?
Yeah, I don't know. I think, I mean, you know, if you look at the history of Eastern Africa and the Great Lakes recently, it is extremely unpredictable. So, you know, in Tanzania, you have President Magufuli, who seemed to be there, and he was going to be there for a very long time, suddenly dying very unexpectedly. We've had the same story in Burundi with the President Nkurunziza, suddenly very young, fit man, dying also, heart failure. The rumor has always been that actually he died of COVID. I think this is a sort of part of the world where things happen very quickly and then they move very quickly. So I'm slightly loath to make any predictions. I think my concern, though, is one of the reasons why I wrote this book is I don't think any system in which one man has as much centralized authority as Kagame has, and has no obvious successors lined up, because the whole story
He's
with
made sure of that.
yeah, the authoritarian leaders always make sure that there are no obvious successors. The obvious successors, you know, went into exile and are now being targeted for assassination. So you know, what's the sustainability of that system? You know, you've got a president, he's not that old yet, but he's never enjoyed fantastic health. You know, well, it could change. It could suddenly change very, very quickly.
Well, but will one of the real sort of bombshells, which you had enough integrity not to put as proven, it's one of these quantum facts, yes or no, is the actual role of the RPF and Kagame in the downing of the helicopter that killed the presidents of Rwanda and Burundi. I mean, you know, you're quite clear to make the point that this does not in any way explain or exonerate the genocide. But I mean, it's a bit like sort of Gavrilo Princeps in Sarajevo with a pistol. You've got a lot to answer for, young man.
Yes, I mean, as I explained in the book, like many journalists, I had heard the story, you know, people were saying when I first covered the genocide that the plane had been brought down by Hutu extremists. And I totally believed that. And I was stunned and shocked when French judge Jean-Louis Bruguière brought out indictments against the whole of the leadership of the RPF. And I was like, goodness me, what's going on?
The French are very Rwandan in their attitude to the truth.
Yeah, I was kind of like, Jesus Christ, what is he thinking of? And it seemed to me at the time, I remember thinking that's a very cynical move. I automatically assumed it was a political move by the French, who have history in Rwanda. But of course, then more and more sort of people were coming out of the RPF, and that's what was worrying. It was people who had worked inside the RPF saying, of course we did it, of course we did it. And while I was interviewing people, you know, all these former high-ranking insiders for the book, they were all, it was like, yeah, we did it, you know, yeah, we lied about it, but we did it. And so in the end, I think I ended up, as I said, I was tendency to believe the whistleblower in these kind of things, because whistleblowers have nothing to lose. As you say, I think it's very mischievous and ridiculous to imply that by bringing down the plane, Kagame, you know, is responsible for the genocide. The genocide was a horror carried out by many Hutu extremists and members of the Juvenal Habyarimana's army, and also ordinary Hutus in the population who are being encouraged and egged on to kill their Tutsi neighbors. But as you say, there's a trigger incident, and it may very well be that the RPF were responsible for the trigger incident.
So it may very well be. You're not saying, gotcha.
It's not for me, is it? No. But I mean, that's certainly, you know, all the whistleblowers I was talking to from the RPF were saying that, and as Philip Retchens, the Belgian professor who has done a lot of work on the downing of the plane, says, he sort of says, isn't it strange that no one has come forth from the ranks of the Hutu extremists and said, actually, we admit it, it was us. You know, as far as I know, there's not a single member of the FDLR who's ever said, yeah, okay, it's a fair cop, we did it. Whereas from the ranks of the RPF, you get endless numbers of people saying it's, you know, it's a fair cop, we did it. And yet for so many years, people were saying, oh, no, they've got axes to grind. Oh, no, they don't know what they're talking about. Oh, no, this is grievance. You know, they're just voicing their personal grievances. You kind of, I don't know.
Well, it's amazing how these become articles of faith with people. You know, the Katyn massacre couldn't have been done by the Russians because they were on our side.
Yeah.
You know, or, you know, the Reichstag fire. If somebody popped up and said, yes, we did it, it wouldn't in any way exonerate what happened afterwards.
Well, I sort of tend to think with the downing of the plane, I now don't know what level of proof would ever be regarded as definitive, because you get a lot of people who are obsessed with ballistics and where people thought they saw the missiles being launched from, and you know what it sounded like. And the problem is I don't know if you've ever been in a war zone, but I certainly have never been able to tell when there's an explosion where it comes from. And so I'm a little suspicious of all these witnesses, you know, who've been questioned over the years, and sort of 20 years later, they can say, yeah, no, it came from there. You know, I heard it, or, you know, it's...
no, it's
not a clear science.
Well, also the question of who's good. I'm fairly sure that anyone who did it will have been silenced in one way or another by now, by whichever side, certainly on the track record of the characters that you were discussing and interviewing. We've got one self-serving for you. Chika from Nigeria has got a soft copy of your book. I suspect that means an ebook. That's naughty. It is a true work of investigative journalism. However, can I get a hard copy of the book in Nigeria? How is this going to sell in Africa? Because it tells a lot of
well, the problem is in the age of COVID, my publishers, I sort of said to them, well, when are the first copies going to land in Africa? And they said, oh, sometime in May. And I was going, May? You know, it came out in April the 1st. So that's very frustrating. I can't tell him, I'm afraid. I don't know when it's going to land in Nigeria. I sometimes, maybe we should try and do a sort of airlift from here. But I mean, you know, I just have to hope that a lot of Africans who want to read it immediately will buy the ebook and download it onto Kindles if they have them. I know it's frustrating, but this is a problem with books in Africa generally.
And I think returning to one of our key interests is the journalism about this, the way this has been written. I mean, looking back, since you and I, to some extent, were guilty of sort of being taken in and taken sides unequivocally one way or the other, you know, so horrified by the genocide that we sort of chose the side of the victims. And then, you know, although it was tempered, Kofi Annan's mea culpa for the UN, the tragedy of Romeo Dallaire, which I think is still, you know, one of the most personal dilemmas. Of course, he wasn't killed, but he was mistreated and maltreated by everybody for not sticking to whatever the facts were supposed to be in Canada. The Canadian military maltreated him. The Canadian government maltreated him for telling the truth. So Rwanda has not been an easy subject for people to cover, has it? And it's, do you think we're getting closer where people can look at it objectively and, you know, do the yes buts and the howevers that are necessary to provide a rounded picture?
Well, I hope my book takes it a little bit further down that line, and that will be the impact. I hate it when people refer to books as definitive. I've sometimes had books I've written and people say, this is the definitive version. You sort of think that's not how history works. You know, there's never a definitive story. We're always, you know, how many, you know, no one would say of a book about Winston Churchill, you know, that it's definitive. You're always reassessing because archives come to light. You know, recently we've had the French archives being made available and being studied by this group of experts, and new archives are now being open to the public. And we're going to keep adjusting. We should keep adjusting our vision of what happened. I think what I do find annoying is, you know, I've adjusted my perspective on Rwanda, in part because the Rwandan Patriotic Front has also changed over the years. So I think that's an appropriate thing to do. It's not the same organization it was when I first encountered it in 1994. But I get annoyed when you meet ministers or, you know, diplomats or people in positions of power who they form their view of what was going on in Rwanda in 1994. They felt immensely guilty about the genocide. They met the RPF and Kagame and was blown away by how impressive he was, and he is very impressive. And then that was it. They have never changed their assessment since. And I think that's just a very intellectually, you know, complacent way of dealing with a country and a history.
And it's happened in other places. I mean, it's happened, as we said, with the Balkans. It's amazing how Milosevic benefited from the sort of penumbra of Tito's non-aligned alliances for many years afterwards, and similar circumstances where, you know, the alliances laid down 50 years ago still have some type of residual hold. There's a whole lot of people who think that Putin is some sort of third international crusading for socialism and anti-imperialism simply because he's in Moscow. I mean, it's difficult to break these habits, we know. Somebody's suggesting, Duncan Kiyingi is saying, you should do something about Museveni and Kayira. They had the same sort of power struggle as Kagame and Romeo.
Yes, yes. I mean, there are no end of, I mean, the Great Lakes is, and East Africa. I mean, there's so many amazing stories. And I think there's so many stories still to be written. I don't know what my next book will be, but every time I'm talking with Rwandan or Ugandan friends, you sort of think, yeah, that's not really been written about. There's so many stories to be teased out, and of course, the problem in the West is we're not really reading about these stories very much. The supply of non-fiction books is not huge.
Unless you've got a grand guignol character like Idi Amin, it's difficult to see how Uganda is going to make the bestseller lists, repay your investment.
But it's one of the most fascinating countries, in Africa, and a very easy place to work for journalists. So that shouldn't be the case.
Well, it's up to you to make it fascinating for a general readership. Then,
well, maybe it's up to Ugandan journalists to do that. I mean, they do. There are a lot of good Ugandan journalists.
Oh, well, good. There's the call. Our Ugandan colleagues, get your word processors and tape recorders out.
Exactly.
So, let's sum it up. I mean, is there hope? Is Kagame going to appear before the International Tribunal?
Well, I mean, you're pitching it at a very high level there.
Deliberately.
High anticipations, very controversial anticipations. I think we can be confident that won't happen. I would like to think that the increased scrutiny and a feistier kind of relationship with donors will mean that he reins in his actions and that he opens up the democratic space a bit more. But I do think that the history of, if you look at other authoritarian regimes, they don't tend to get less authoritarian. They tend to get more authoritarian until there's basically some kind of explosion. And then we get a new system in place, after a lot of turbulence. So I would like to think that some oversight and nudging and scolding and using the leverage that aid offers might sort of change behavior, but I think it's unlikely.
Yeah, I suspect this might explain some of the ambivalence of the Rwandans about the tribunal, though, mightn't it?
Well, I mean, as the head would be accountable by the ICR in any case, because I think they're immune from prosecution.
Okay, well, I think we're getting towards the end now. So I've got to thank you all. Thank particularly our guest, Michela Wrong, and thank you all for coming.